It was supposed to be a routine trip. Daniel Carter, a retired rancher in his 60s, had driven into the city to pick up supplies. The streets of downtown Los Angeles had changed over the years. More traffic, more noise, and far more homeless camps than he remembered. As he waited at a red light, his eyes drifted to the alley beside a convenience store. And that's when he saw him. A man, hunched over on a tattered piece of cardboard, his long, unkempt beard hiding most of his face. His clothes were filthy, his hands covered in grime. Daniel frowned. There was something familiar about him. The light turned green, but Daniel didn't move. He knew that face. He pulled over, got out of his truck, and walked toward the alley. "Hey!" he called out cautiously. The homeless man didn't react. Daniel stepped closer. "Tom?" The man finally looked up. It took a second, but recognition flickered in his tired, sunken eyes. "Dan?" His voice was raspy, disbelieving. Daniel felt his stomach tighten. It was him. Tom Williams. His best friend from 40 years ago. Tom Williams looked nothing like the man Daniel Carter remembered. Back in the day, Tom had been a strong, fearless Marine, someone Daniel had always admired. But now, he was a shell of that man, gaunt, tired, and weathered by years of hardship. Daniel crouched down. "Tom, what the hell happened to you?" Tom gave a weak chuckle. "Long story, pal." His voice was rough, strained, as if he hadn't spoken much in days. Daniel felt a lump form in his throat. They had once been inseparable, two small-town boys who joined the military together. But life had taken them in different directions. Daniel had returned home after his service, built a life, started a ranch. Tom had disappeared. And now, here he was, homeless. "You got anywhere to go?" Daniel asked, already knowing the answer. Tom shook his head. Daniel exhaled. "All right, let's get you out of here." Tom hesitated. "Dan, I don't want your charity." "Shut up," Daniel said firmly. "Get in the truck." The drive back to Daniel's ranch was mostly quiet. Tom sat stiffly in the passenger seat, clutching the straps of the old backpack he had with him. Daniel stole glances at him every few minutes. He looked uneasy, like he didn't know whether to trust this situation or run from it. "You hungry?" Daniel asked. Tom nodded. "Been a while since I had a real meal." Daniel took a detour, stopping at a diner just outside of town. They sat in a booth by the window, and when the waitress came over, Tom ordered like a man who hadn't eaten in days. "Burger, large fries. And a coffee. No, make it two." Daniel smirked. "Still drink it black?" Tom chuckled. "Some things don't change." As they waited for the food, Daniel leaned forward. "So tell me, how did you end up out there?" Tom's face darkened. He stared at the table for a moment before answering. "Came back from my last tour overseas. Tried to adjust, but it's not that easy." Daniel knew that feeling well. The world expected you to go back to normal after the war, but normal didn't exist anymore. "I lost my job. My wife left. VA gave me some pills, told me to get therapy, but that wasn't enough." Daniel listened, his heart aching. "Ended up on the streets. You think you'll never be one of those guys, the ones holding a cardboard sign. But all it takes is one bad month, then another." Daniel clenched his jaw. "You should have called me." Tom gave him a tired smile. "Didn't think you'd want to hear from me." Daniel shook his head. "Damn fool." The food arrived and Tom practically inhaled his meal. Watching him eat, Daniel made a silent promise. "I won't let you go back to that alley." When they got to the ranch, Tom hesitated at the door. "You sure about this?" he asked. "I don't want to be a burden." Daniel sighed. "Tom, you saved my ass more times than I can count back in the Corps. Let me return the favor." Tom nodded and stepped inside. The guest room was small but comfortable. Clean sheets, a soft bed, probably the first real bed Tom had slept in for years. "You need anything?" Daniel asked. Tom shook his head. "This is more than enough." But later that night, Daniel heard movement. He walked to the guest room and found Tom sleeping on the floor, curled up with a blanket. Daniel's heart twisted. Even after all these years, Tom didn't know how to feel safe. Over the next few weeks, Tom slowly adjusted to life at the ranch. At first, he was hesitant, always on edge, always looking over his shoulder. But Daniel gave him small tasks to do: fixing fences, cleaning out the barn, helping with the horses. At first, it was just to keep Tom busy. But soon Daniel realized something. Tom needed this: the structure, the purpose, the feeling of usefulness. And little by little, he started to come back to life. One afternoon, they sat on the porch drinking coffee. Tom looked out over the fields. "I forgot how good it feels to work with my hands." Daniel smiled. "Beats sitting in an alley, huh?" Tom chuckled. Yeah, it does. But recovery wasn't linear. Some days were better than others. One night, Daniel woke to the sound of yelling. He rushed to the guest room and found Tom thrashing in bed, covered in sweat. "Tom, wake up!" Tom shot up, gasping, his eyes wide with terror. Daniel sat down beside him. "Nightmare?" Tom nodded, rubbing his temples. "Same damn one. I see their faces, the guys we lost." Daniel sighed. He knew those ghosts all too well. "You ever talk to anyone about it?" Tom scoffed. "You think the VA cared? I tried. They gave me pills, told me to adjust. Didn't work." Daniel looked at his old friend. "You don't have to do this alone, Tom. We'll find real help. The right kind." Tom exhaled. For the first time in a long time, he believed that might be true. One day, Daniel was watching the news when a segment came on about homeless veterans. Tom watched in silence, his jaw tightening. Hundreds of thousands of vets on the streets. Daniel muttered, "It's a damn disgrace." Tom swallowed hard. "I was one of them." Daniel turned to him. "Not anymore. But what about the others?" Tom frowned. "What do you mean?" Daniel leaned forward. "You know what it's like. You've lived it. You could help them." Tom hesitated. "How?" Daniel pulled out his phone. Let's start with your story." They recorded a short video. Tom talked about his experience, his service, his struggles, how close he came to giving up. Then Daniel posted it online. Within days, it went viral. People wanted to help. Donations poured in. Job offers came. And then came the biggest surprise: a call from a veteran outreach program. "We saw Tom's story," the director said. "We want him to speak at an event. Maybe even help lead one of our programs." Tom was stunned. "You really think I can do that?" Daniel clapped him on the back. "I know you can." Months later, Tom was standing on a stage speaking to a room full of veterans. "I wouldn't be here today if it weren't for my best friend," he said, looking at Daniel in the crowd. "We all need someone like that. And now it's my turn to be that person for someone else." The applause was deafening. And for the first time in years, Tom felt at peace. After that first speech, Tom felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. His life was no longer just about surviving. It was about making a difference. But the road ahead would be filled with obstacles. He had barely scratched the surface of what it meant to fight for veterans still struggling, and there were days when the weight of it all felt crushing. "Do you think I can really do this?" Tom asked Daniel, staring out over the ranch one evening, as the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon. They sat in rocking chairs on the porch, a bottle of whiskey between them. Daniel took a slow sip from his glass. "You've already started, haven't you? The first step's the hardest, but you've got the heart, Tom. That's what matters." Tom nodded, but doubt lingered. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The system was broken, and he was just one man. But if he could reach even one other person the way Daniel had reached him, it would be worth it. Tom's newfound sense of purpose led him to a local veterans outreach center. The director, a former Army sergeant named Jack Hudson, had heard about Tom's viral video and offered him a chance to work with the center. Tom had been eager to dive in, but the reality of the job was far different than he'd imagined. His first day was a whirlwind of paperwork, phone calls, and meetings with veterans who were skeptical of anyone who didn't understand their struggle firsthand. "They'll try to make it seem like they're fine," Jack had warned him, "but they're not. They just don't know how to ask for help." Tom's first case was a man named Billy Jackson, a young Marine who had recently returned from his second tour in Afghanistan. Billy was severely wounded, physically and mentally, and his bitterness was palpable. "Why should I trust you?" Billy spat when Tom offered a hand. "You don't know what it's like out there." Tom didn't take offense. He had been in Billy's shoes once, angry, lost, and unwilling to admit he needed help. Instead of pushing Billy away, Tom shared his story. He spoke about his own struggles, how he had fallen into the same dark place after his last tour. Billy's eyes softened, but he didn't speak for a long time. Finally, he muttered, "Maybe you do get it." Tom had his first breakthrough. It wasn't much, just a crack in Billy's armor, but it was progress. Despite the small victories, there were days when Tom wanted to give up. The memories of his past, the pain of his time on the streets, would resurface at night. His flashbacks were sharp, violent, and vivid. He'd wake up sweating, his heart pounding, unsure of where he was. Daniel was there, though, always a steady presence. He helped Tom through the nights when the darkness seemed too much to bear. One evening, Tom found himself back at a bar he hadn't stepped into in years, the Silver Dollar Tavern, a place where he used to drown his memories in cheap whiskey. The memories that surfaced were far from comforting. The faces of friends lost in battle, the laughter of soldiers who would never return, the hollow emptiness he had tried to escape. He sat down at the bar, his hands trembling. The bartender, a woman named Maggie, recognized him immediately. "You've been away a long time, Tom," she said quietly, sliding him a drink. Tom shook his head. "Not sure I'm ready to be here again." The temptation to relapse was strong, and for a moment he nearly gave in. But then he remembered Billy, the young Marine he was trying to help, and the people depending on him to stay sober. Tom had made a promise to himself and to them that he wouldn't go back. He stood up, tossing the drink aside, and walked out into the cool night air. The streets of the city seemed foreign to him now, but the pull of his old life was still there, lurking in the shadows. That night, Tom called Daniel. "I almost fell back," he said into the phone, his voice thick with emotion. Daniel's voice was steady on the other end. "But you didn't, Tom. You're not alone anymore. Remember that." The more time Tom spent helping others, the more he began to understand the system's flaws and its opportunities for change. He started writing about his experiences, about the cracks in the system that left veterans like him to fend for themselves. He connected with local lawmakers and began advocating for better care for veterans, especially those struggling with PTSD, addiction, and homelessness. There were heated debates and many closed doors, but Tom's story carried weight. The media picked up on his efforts, and he became an unlikely voice for change in the political sphere. One day, Tom received an invitation to speak at a Veterans Advocacy Summit in Washington, D.C. It was a prestigious event, and the pressure weighed heavily on him. He would be standing before some of the most influential people in the country, politicians, activists, and media moguls, and speaking about his journey from homelessness to recovery. The night before the event, Tom paced back and forth in his hotel room. Daniel was there, of course, always supporting him. "You nervous?" Daniel asked. Tom nodded, his hands shaking slightly. "What if I say the wrong thing?" Daniel smiled. "You speak from the heart, Tom. That's all anyone needs." The next morning, Tom stood before a packed room in the grand ballroom. As he began speaking, his voice wavered at first. But the more he spoke about his struggles, his survival, and his mission to make things right, the more powerful his words became. "I wasn't supposed to make it out," Tom said, his eyes scanning the room. "I was supposed to die in the streets forgotten. But someone gave me a chance. Now it's my turn to do the same for others." The room erupted in applause, and Tom felt something shift deep inside him. This was his purpose. With his newfound platform, Tom worked tirelessly to push for reform. He traveled across the country, meeting with other veterans, speaking at rallies, and advocating for better programs to support those who had served. His message was clear. Veterans don't need pity. They need respect and a chance to heal. Through his work, Tom helped create several new initiatives aimed at providing housing, employment, and mental health services to veterans. His story inspired thousands to take action, and slowly but surely change began to happen. Years later, Tom sat on the porch of his modest home in Carmel, California, with Daniel by his side. He had become a symbol of recovery, an advocate for those who had once been invisible. As they watched the sunset together, Tom reflected on everything he had been through. From the dark streets of Los Angeles to standing in the halls of Congress, he had come a long way. "You did it, Tom," Daniel said, his voice full of pride. Tom smiled, shaking his head. No, we did it. Together. And for the first time in his life, Tom Williams felt that his past had shaped him into someone who could make a real difference. He had survived, and now he was helping others do the same.